At the very end of the parsha, we have the pasuk where it says, "Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim." Yidden have settled in Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen. Vayeachazu ba. We'll see in a minute what Vayeachazu ba means. Vayifru vayirbu ma'od, and they were fruitful and multiplied very much. What does the word Vayeachazu ba mean? So there are two explanations. The simple meaning of the pasuk Vayeachazu is, as Rashi explains it, Loshen achuzah. It's an expression of a possession. So the Yidden had this as their possession, the land of Goshen. The Medrash explains it, that ha'aretz hoysoi chezes bohem, the land was holding on to them, like a person that is being held onto against his will. So the word vayeachazu, therefore, is from the expression of achiza, of holding on to something. Now, why according to Pshat can't we learn that the word vayeachazu over here means from the expression of holding on, an expression of achiza? So the Rebbe says, because from the continuation of the pasuk, where it says that Yidden were vayeshev, they were settled there, and vayeachazu ba, vayifru, and they multiplied and increased, etc. It seems to be saying that the Torah is telling us that vayeachazu ba is the way that they settled in Goshen, and this was the way, this is what caused, this is what brought about to vayifru vayirbu ma'od. The way they were settled is what caused them to multiply and to increase, etc. And therefore, according to Pshat, we cannot learn like the Medrash that they were settled there against their will, because clearly, if they're there in a way, if they are there in a way that's against their will, being oppressed, etc., then that is not going to lead to being fruitful and multiplying, etc. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, we also can say that vayeachazu ba would mean, still translating as holding on, but perhaps it might mean that the Yidden are holding on to it by settling the land. They are holding on to the land. The problem then is with the nekudos on the word vayeachazu. Then it should have been vayoichazu ba, would have meant that they're holding on to it rather than vayeachazu ba, which, if you're translating as meaning from the lashon, from the expression of holding on, would mean that they are being held by the land. And therefore, going back to the original meaning of the pasuk according to Pshat, therefore, vayeachazu ba, Rashi is telling us it's from the word achuza, which means it was their possession. The Rebbe says, we discussed many times that when we have several pirushim of Razal on the same word or on the same inyan, it doesn't mean that these two interpretations are completely unrelated to each other, but on the contrary, since they are both interpretations on the same word, there must be some sort of connection between them. The problem in our case is that seemingly these two pirushim, not only don't they seem to be connected, but they seem to be completely opposite in toichen, in their content, from each other. Why is that? According to the simple meaning of the pasuk, the word vayeachazu ba means the pasuk is emphasizing how the Yidden are settling in the land of Goshen, and it's a way that is becoming their land, their achuzah, their possession. On the other hand, according to the Medrash, what seems to be coming out is that the emphasis is exactly the opposite, that the Yidden are being held on to over here against their will. It's not their place. This is against their will. They don't want to be here. Says the Rebbe, this is going to be understood after first explaining the Rashi just before this one, the previous Dibur HaMaschil, and that is on the beginning of the pasuk, the part of the pasuk that's the introduction to Vayeachazu ba. Rashi goes on the words, is discussing the words Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim, Yidden settled in the land of Mitzrayim, and Rashi says Veheichon, and where? Be'eretz Goshen, in the land of Goshen, shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim, which is part of Mitzrayim. What's bothering Rashi? What's Rashi coming to tell us? So Mefarshim say that what Rashi is coming is to preempt a question from the expression of the pasuk. The pasuk says be'eretz Mitzrayim, be'eretz Goshen. Now it sounds like these are two different places, two different aratzis, two different lands, and therefore Rashi is clarifying on the words Vayeshev be'eretz Mitzrayim, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim. Rashi is telling us Veheichon, and where within Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen. It's almost as if in the pasuk itself it says be'eretz Mitzrayim, and within that whereabout, particularly in the land of Goshen. But the Rebbe says it's not understood. Number one, then why is Rashi at the end of the Rashi, after saying Veheichon be'eretz Goshen, he adds Shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim, which is part of Mitzrayim. I mean, that's clearly understood from what the pasuk is saying. And what Rashi says, when the pasuk says, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim, and Rashi then says, Veheichon, and we're within that, be'eretz Goshen, so that's understood then it's within Mitzrayim. Why does Rashi have to add the words, Shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim? The Rebbe says, in truth, we could ask the question on the pasuk itself. Why does the pasuk have to say that it's in Mitzrayim, and then tell us that it's within Eretz Goshen? Wouldn't have it been enough if it just said Be'eretz Goshen? We would have known already that it's a Mitzrayim, because earlier on in this parsha itself, it says clearly that Eretz Goshen is part of Mitzrayim. And finally, the Rebbe asks on the Dibur HaMaschil, if Rashi is trying to explain to us, is this arichos of why the pasuk says Be'eretz Mitzrayim, Be'eretz Goshen, why is he quoting from the pasuk also the words Vayeshev Yisrael? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, Rashi is actually coming to deal with and to preempt a question, a contradiction on the general content of our pasuk, contrasting that with something that we were told in an earlier parsha. So by the Brisbane Absorim, Hashem tells Avram, Ki ger yi zaracha be'eretz lo lohem. Your children are going to be foreigners, they're going to be strangers in a land that's not theirs. And eventually they're going to go out with great wealth, etc. In other words, before Yidden come to Eretz Yisrael, they first need to go through a state of Golus. And that is specifically by being a geir, by being strangers in a foreign land. The question is, how can we say that the Yidden are sort of being yoitze this Golus, they are having this Golus while being in Mitzrayim, if we find over here in this pasuk that the way they were in Mitzrayim was in a way of Vayeshev. It says, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim. The word Vayeshev, this expression Vayeshev, which means settling, but from the word Toishav, like being a resident, is exactly the opposite of a geir, of being a stranger or an immigrant. Furthermore, they're in Eretz Goshen, which on Eretz Goshen, the pasuk had told us already earlier, this is Meitav Aretz, this is the very best land of Mitzrayim. And furthermore, as the pasuk itself finishes off of here, Vayeachazuba, which we're being told it's Lashon Achuzah, that it becomes their achuzah, it becomes their possession. How could possibly all of this be considered what Hashem had told Avraham Avinu, that they are going to be ger yi zaracha, they're going to be foreigners? The Rebbe is now answering one of the questions immediately. The Rebbe says this is why Rashi in the Dibur HaMaschil actually quotes the words Vayeshev Yisrael, because the difficult in our pasuk, as mentioned, is exactly this point of how Yidden are being Vayeshev, they're settling like residents in the land of Goshen when they're supposed to be Geirim, they're supposed to be foreigners and strangers. It is this question that the way Rashi is explaining the pasuk is coming to preempt when he says, he's explained already Be'eretz Mitzrayim, V'heichon Be'eretz Goshen, and then he adds the word Shehi Me'eretz Mitzrayim. Rashi is telling us that it is part of Mitzrayim. In other words, what's Rashi telling us? That at the end of the day, no matter how great Goshen is, it's still part of Eretz Mitzrayim. It's not Eretz Canaan. And therefore, their settling over there in Eretz Goshen is still considered Golus, because by the actual fact that they're not in Eretz Canaan, their land, therefore they are still considered a geir, foreigners in a land that doesn't belong to them. Says the Rebbe, but this is still not completely smooth and understood, at least b'pnimi yisonyonim. Why is that? It's known that the purpose of Golus Mitzrayim was that Yidden should be able to be purified over there, to become deserving and fitting for receiving the Torah and being able to eventually go into Eretz Yisrael. So how, at the end of the day, how could we say that this is all being accomplished? The kavanah, in other words, this way of being purified through Golus, which is supposed to be the Golus and the enslavery in Mitzrayim, how is this being accomplished by Vayeshev Yisrael, just by the fact that they're sitting or settling in the land of Mitzrayim? The question is even stronger once we see how Vayeachazuba is explained in the Chelek HaDrasha b'Torah, like in the Medrash part of Torah. Why is the question even stronger? But the Rebbe first, and before getting to this, the Rebbe says, Ubehektim, by first prefacing another point. The Rebbe says, from the fact that the pasuk says, Vayeachazuba, which is an expression of achuzah, an expression that it's their possession, it would seem to be then that Eretz Goshen, it was and remained an achuzah, a possession. Sometimes we also understand the word achuzah even from the word of as an inheritance, remaining by Yidden, that this is their land. And l'cha'ira, this is totally not understood. How is it possible to say about a part of Mitzrayim that this is an achuzah, that this is a possession and an inheritance for Bnei Yisrael? We know Eretz Canaan, this is the Yerusha for Yidden. As the pasuk says, Hashem says to Avraham Avinu, "Loses l'choes ha'aretz azois l'rishta." I'm going to give you this land to inherit, not Eretz Mitzrayim. Now, says the Rebbe, according to Derech HaPshat, this is not really such a question, because since the Yidden were in Goshen during the whole time while they were in Mitzrayim, which is 210 years, the gematria of the word redu that we have, as the pasuk says, so therefore, you could still say that, yes, this is their possession while they're there. However, according to the Dirash of Torah, the section of Torah that focuses more on the inner meaning of what it's all about, so it's not so smooth, it's not so simple. How can we be calling this our achuzah, our possession, our inheritance, if that's not part of Eretz Yisrael? The Rebbe says that the Radak in Sefer Yoshua and Tanakh brings in the name of Dirash. We have over there a pasuk that Yoshua conquered the land of Goshen. So the question is, what Goshen is this referring to? So the Radak says, according to the Drash, according to the Medrash, that this is actually referring to Goshen of Mitzrayim. And he says, V'hi nivlas b'soich orei Yisrael, that this was sort of absorbed. Literally, the word nivlas means swallowed up. In other words, this was taken along as well together with the other cities of Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, it's being counted as part of the cities of Nachlas Bnei Yehuda, the inheritance of the possession of Bnei Yehuda. Now, if that's the case, seemingly we would be able to say, at least according to this level of Dirash in Torah, we would be able to then perhaps explain Vayigash that Eretz Goshen is becoming their achuzah also from the meaning of a Yerusha, their inheritance, because it was taken, it was swallowed up, it was taken, became part of the cities of Eretz Yisrael in the time of Yoshua. The Rebbe says that it's difficult to say this, because how does it make sense to say that in the time when Yidden are now settled in Mitzrayim, Vayeshev Yisrael, this settling of the land of Goshen should be called an achuzah, a possession or an inheritance, because hundreds of years later, Eretz Goshen will be taken by Yoshua to be made as part of the cities of Yisrael. So we're back to the question, how are we calling this place an achuzah for the Yidden, or a Yerusha for the Yidden? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, we find in the Medrash that Paroi, we know the story when Paroi took Sarah, and the Medrash says that Paroi had given her, as part of the gifts that he had given her Eretz Goshen la'achuzah, he had given her the land of Goshen to take that as a possession and as an inheritance. And therefore, the Yidden settling in the land of Goshen is actually as part of the inheritance of Sarah Imenu. If that's the case, Yidden are receiving the land of Goshen as a Yerusha from Sarah. Now, based on all of this, that the Yidden now have the land of Goshen and it's actually theirs, we're trying to clarify, how do they have an achuzah outside of Eretz Yisrael? But we're saying, yes, this is their Yerusha from Sarah. But now, the previous question becomes even stronger. We're trying to understand how they could be Yoitze, the Shibud Mitzrayim, while being in Goshen. Well, the Shibud of Golos while being in Goshen. So says the Rebbe, the question now becomes even stronger. How is it possible that the Yidden can be Yoitzes, this Golos of Mitzrayim, while they're in Goshen, if Goshen belongs to them as a Yerusha, and therefore it's again clearly not Ger, that they're strangers in a foreign land? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand this based on what's explained in Torah, that all of the details of the avodah, of the hard work that Yidden had in Golos Mitzrayim, that the pasuk describes as ba'avodah kasha, the hard labor, b'chomer, the mortar, b'lveinim, the bricks, etc., all also are true and apply also in a spiritual sense. And this applies in the area of Torah, of learning and involving oneself with Torah. It says in the Zohar that ba'avodah kasha, the hard work, the hard labor, in Torah that would mean the area of kushya. Kasha is the idea of kushya, of questions. You learn something and there's difficult questions. B'chomer, the cement or the mortar, refers to a kal v'chomer that we have in Torah. B'leveinim is from the word of libun. Libun hilchas, clarifying halachos. So therefore, when a Yid works hard, toils in the avodah kasha and the hard labor of Torah, In that way, he could get rid of, he could be yoitz and not to have the hard work of Golus Mitzrayim. And he doesn't have to do it physically. This is very similar to a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that says, Kol HaMakabel Olav Oil Torah, anyone that accepts upon themselves the yoke of Torah. And it specifically says over here, oil, the yoke. That means it's a hard work, as we mentioned before in the Zohar. So if you accept a hard work from Torah, then ma'avirin mimenu oil malchus v'oil derech eretz, then all other sorts of yokes of government and business and so on is all removed from him. He doesn't have to worry about these other gashmiistic things. Says the Rebbe, so the same thing we can now apply in our case. When Yidden are in the land of Goshen, they were able to be yoitze, they were able to accomplish all of the inyanim of the golus and shibud and the enslavement of Mitzrayim through their hard work in Limud HaTorah. We know that Yaakov and his children have established a base Talmud, a yeshiva in Goshen, and when the Yidden were working hard there in Torah, they're being yoitze, they're getting rid of the obligation of having to work hard in the physical sense. The Rebbe says, this is also the remez. We know there's a concept of Yenushal Torah, that in Rashi there's also hinted in Yonim of the wine of Torah, of the Pnimius of Torah. Where Rashi says, that it's from the word Achuza. Says the Rebbe, this idea we're discussing is also hinted in these words. That the time of Golus Mitzrayim, in that first period when the Yidden are there, when the Yidden are settling there, Vayeshev Yisrael, was not anything to do with hard work physically. On the contrary, at the time it was in a way that they felt that it's mate of Aretz, that it's actually the best part of the land, and that it's their achuzah, that it's their possession, as Rashi says. Meaning to say that everyone knew and everyone recognized that Yidden are finding themselves in their land, it belongs to them, where they could act as they wish, how they want, and they're totally not under Shibud Mitzrayim. So where did the Golus express itself? That expressed itself. They're working hard. The Shibud, the enslavement, is in the hard work of Torah. Says the Rebbe, but there's still further clarification needed. Since at the end of the day, Yidden are yarshening, Yidden are inheriting, according to the way the Medrash said it, the land of Goshen from Sarah. So we explained why it could be considered hard work. But how could we consider it be'eretz loy lohem? How could we consider it that this is a golus in a land that's not theirs, if in fact the land is theirs? Says the Rebbe, the explanation is, even though it's true that Eretz Goshen belonged to Yidden because of this inheritance from Sarah, nevertheless, it still does not contain the same level of Kedusha that Eretz Yisrael has. Eretz Yisrael being called a land that Einei Hashem Elokecha ba, that Hashem's eyes are constantly upon the land, and so on. And this is why it was considered a Golus be'eretz loy lohem, even while they're settled in Goshen, and even in that first period, even during that first time, because Yidden were feeling the tsar, Yidden were feeling the pain for the fact that they're not in a place of Eretz Asher Tamid Einei Hashem Elokecha ba, that land that has that Kedusha, where Hashem's eyes are always upon the land. And with that itself, it's considered this is not our land. It does not have the chshivus and the Kedusha that Yidden are deserving to have. And from having this tsar itself, that takes off some of the enslavement and the suffering that they should have had physically in Golus Mitzrayim. Now, even though in the beginning of the Golus, it wasn't a way of Vayigash, that they're feeling it's theirs, but that itself is already considered some sort of Yerida, some sort of descent, compared to their state, their level, as they would have been in Eretz Canaan. And as a result of this, this ultimately leads that later and eventually it leads to a Golus and Shibud Mitzrayim, enslavement of Mitzrayim in the literal sense. That means that after that first period is over, in the time, as the Pasuk describes it, Vayamos Yosef, Yosef passes away and his brothers and that whole generation. And as a result of that, they're now starting to be lacking in this Yegiyah and the toil of Torah, in this yeshiva that Yaakov and his children have set up. And they started forgetting the tsar, the pain that they're in a land that's not really theirs. This is what happens now, is that the Shibud Mitzrayim, the enslavement of Mitzrayim, now starts in the literal sense. To the extent, as it says, that it seemed to them that after this period, when Yosef and his brother has passed away, etc., it's as if they just came down to Mitzrayim now. In other words, now is where the whole trouble is starting. They're starting to forget that really this is a land that belongs to Yidden, and they're starting to feel the bitterness and the trouble of the Golus. Says the Rebbe, this is what Rashi is actually emphasizing in his Pirush. which we asked before about when it says Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim. And Rashi says Veheichen and where? Be'eretz Goshen. Shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim, which is part of Mitzrayim, means like this. In the beginning of Galus Mitzrayim, so it was in a way that it was in Eretz Goshen, as Rashi says Veheichen. So where is it? They're in Eretz Goshen, they're in the best part of the land. But on the other hand, Rashi is telling us you need to remember Shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim, but it's still part of Mitzrayim. Meaning to say, the actual fact that Yidden need to settle in the land of Goshen means already that there's some sort of descent into Mitzrayim. And furthermore, that Goshen itself is transformed into the worst Golus Mitzrayim. As Rashi says, Shehi me'eretz Mitzrayim. That means to say that when they don't utilize the best of the land of Goshen in Avodas Hashem, and on the contrary, as we have another pasuk that describes Vayishman Yisrael Vayivot, that as a result of all the gashmis, of all the fats that they have, it causes them to rebel against Hashem. Then Eretz Goshen itself, where Yidden were living throughout the Golos, now became a place of Shibud Mitzrayim, of the hard work of Mitzrayim, Kipshutoi, in the literal sense. Says the Rebbe, this explanation of Vayeochazu, from the word of achuzah, that Yidden, we also said it means the expression of yarshening, of inheriting the land of Goshen, also fits very much with the whole idea of what Golus Mitzrayim is, b'pnimi Yisrael, according to the way Chassidus explains it. And from this will also be understood that even though, according to Pshat, the word, when we say Vayeochazu, it's from the word achuzah, doesn't necessarily have to mean an inheritance. It can mean, as we said before, just it's their possession. Doesn't have to mean necessarily the idea of Yerusha, the Yidden are having the Goshen as an inheritance. But Rashi is hinting to this at least, with the words Lashon Achuzah, that it also contains this idea of Yerusha and inheritance, and is Yena Shal Torah, where that's also always hidden in Rashi. So what's this idea of Yerusha specifically? So the explanation is that the point of Golus Mitzrayim was that Yidden are going to elevate and take all the holy sparks that are found in Mitzrayim. This is really the inner meaning of what the pasuk says, "Vayinotzlu es Mitzrayim," that they emptied out Mitzrayim, and the Chazal tell us that they emptied it out completely. The Gemara says, "Asua kimitzudo she'ein bo dogon." They made it like a trap that the hunters would set up. They would put grain in for the birds to be that should be the bait for the birds. So imagine the trap without any grain, or kimitzula she'ein bo dogon, where the depths of the sea where there are no fish. They didn't empty out Mitzrayim completely. They elevated all of the sparks. All of the holy sparks that originate in Olam HaToyu, that were found in Mitzrayim, and the Yidden now elevated and took out all of these sparks. That was the point of Galus Mitzrayim. This is what Rashi is hinting to with the words Vayeochazu ba, that it's from the word of Achuzah. That the whole purpose, the point, the intent of Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim, of Yidden being in Mitzrayim, of Galus Mitzrayim, was that Yidden should, as a result of being there, they should be yoirish, they should inherit these sparks of Olam HaToyu. So in Chassidus, as we're about to see right now, this idea of taking those sparks of Olam HaToyu is often referred to as yarshening, as inheriting those lights of Toyu. The Rebbe says it's known a mimer of the Friedrich Rebbe, that the order of Yerusha, the way of how inheritance works by Umas Olam, by the Goyim. So we have a pasuk. Pasuk speaks about the idea of Yerusha, where it says that if a person doesn't have a son, then the whole seder of how it passes on the different descendants and so on. If there's no descendants, then it goes to the brother. So the Friedrich Rebbe explains in a mimer that the seder over here is, the pasuk says, "Ali och Esav liYaakov." So the inheritance, these holy sparks that were by Esav, these high oiris atoyu, are not passing. There is no descendant, so to speak, of Esav in the spiritual sense to take these sparks. It's the brother Yaakov that's yoirish, that inherits these sparks, the sparks of Olam HaToyu. Says the Rebbe, according to all of this, we can now understand the connection between the two pirushim of Vayeochazu ba that we had all the way in the beginning of the Sicha. According to the simple meaning, Vayeochazu is from the word of Achuzah, as we said, because simply and bechitzoyni yisayin, this is in the time of Parshas Vayigash, and the enslavement didn't start yet, Golus didn't start yet. On the contrary, this is a time where what seems to be very clear is that Eretz Goshen, the Yidden took hold of it, the Yidden have possession over it, it's theirs. Absolutely. But comes the Medrash is looking at every single thing in a more panimiistic way, and the Medrash says, Vayeachazu is a lashon of achiza, which means that the land is holding on to them against their will. Meaning to say that since, as we explained before, the idea that they are settled in Goshen Although externally seems like a very, very great thing. They're in power, they're the ones in charge, etc. But as we said before, really, this is already a Yerida, this is already a descent, it's part of Mitzrayim. And furthermore, this is what leads some room that there should eventually be the Shibud Mitzrayim in the literal sense. So therefore, the Medrash is telling us that the Pnimius, in a hidden way, this Yerida is already in a way that the land is holding on to them against their will. But on the other hand, the reason why they're in Mitzrayim, what's the Pnimius reason for it? Why there has to be this idea of according to the way the Medrash says it. In other words, that the land is holding on to them. Why are they there? This in turn is hinted in the inner part of Rashi, in the Yeinish Ol Toyd and the Chassidus that's hinted in the Rashi. Going back to the first pshat, that the inner intent of Golus Mitzrayim is, in other words, again, as the Medrash says that Vayigash is more indicating the Golus. But the point of it is more Meloshan Achuzah, because we also said Achuzah is from the word of Yerusha, that the Yidden are going to inherit all of the good and those sparks of Toyah that had fallen down through the Shviras HaKelim into Mitzrayim, and finally that leads to V'acharei Chen Yetzer, that then the Yidden leave Berchush Gadol with great wealth.